In the spring of 1917, the United States stood at a crossroads that would define not only its role in a distant European war, but its identity as a global power. Because for nearly 3 years, the conflict across the Atlantic had raged with relentless intensity, while America watched from a position of official neutrality, trading with both sides, debating in newspapers and Congress, and asking a question that felt both practical and moral at the same time. Should the United States remain apart from the catastrophe unfolding overseas, or should it step into the storm and accept the consequences that would inevitably follow? When President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany in April of that year, he did so knowing that the nation was not fully prepared, that its army was small by European standards, that its officer corps lacked experience in modern industrial warfare, and that sending American soldiers across the Atlantic would require not only ships and supplies, but leadership capable of transforming a modest peacetime force into a credible army that could stand beside the exhausted veterans of Britain and France. At the center of that transformation stood General John J. Pershing, a disciplined, reserved officer whose career had taken him from the American West to the Philippines and into the complex expedition into Mexico, and who now faced the most demanding assignment of his life, because he would not merely command troops, but would shape how the United States entered the First World War, how American soldiers would fight, and how the nation would be perceived by its allies and adversaries alike. The question was not simply whether America would fight, but how it would fight, and whether its army would be absorbed into existing European commands or stand as an independent force with its own identity, its own doctrine, and its own responsibility for success or failure. And in that decision lay the future of American military power. When Pershing arrived in France in June 1917, he encountered a war unlike anything the United States had previously experienced, because the Western Front was defined by trench systems that stretched for miles, by artillery barrages that reshaped landscapes, and by years of attrition that had drained the manpower and morale of European armies. And as he toured the front lines and observed the conditions firsthand, he understood that American forces would require not only training but clarity of purpose if they were to contribute meaningfully rather than symbolically. Allied commanders, facing mounting casualties and desperate for reinforcements, urged Pershing to integrate American units directly into British and French divisions, arguing that such integration would accelerate their deployment and strengthen the front immediately. But Pershing resisted this pressure with quiet firmness, insisting that American soldiers must fight as part of an independent American Expeditionary Forces, because he believed that national cohesion, morale, and long-term effectiveness depended upon preserving a distinct command structure rather than scattering troops piecemeal into foreign formations. This decision was not universally welcomed, and it required diplomatic skill as well as military conviction, because Pershing had to balance gratitude for Allied support with the determination to protect American autonomy. And he knew that if American units proved ineffective or disorganized, critics would point to his insistence on independence as a costly mistake. Meanwhile, back home, the United States undertook a rapid expansion of its armed forces through the Selective Service Act, registering millions of men for potential service, transforming civilian factories into producers of uniforms, rifles, artillery pieces, and transport equipment, and creating an industrial mobilization effort that would eventually astonish observers with its scale, even as early shortages and logistical challenges tested patience on both sides of the Atlantic. Training camps sprang up across the country, where recruits learned not only drill and discipline, but the fundamentals of trench warfare, marksmanship, and coordinated movement. And although many instructors had limited experience with the specific conditions of the Western Front, there was an intense commitment to preparation, because everyone understood that the credibility of the nation was at stake, and that the first major American engagement would be scrutinized closely by allies and enemies alike. When American troops began arriving in larger numbers in 1918, their presence carried symbolic weight beyond their immediate tactical value, because exhausted French civilians lined streets to welcome them, children waved flags, and newspapers reported on the arrival of fresh forces whose enthusiasm contrasted with the fatigue visible in European armies that had endured years of relentless conflict. And in those moments, Pershing understood that morale itself was a strategic resource. Yet enthusiasm alone could not substitute for experience, and Pershing emphasized training, coordination, and offensive spirit, believing that mobility and determination could overcome the stagnation that trench warfare had imposed, even as he studied the lessons learned by Allied forces and adjusted American tactics accordingly, blending innovation with realism rather than clinging stubbornly to preconceived notions. By September 1918, the American Expeditionary Forces were ready for a large-scale independent operation, and the target chosen was the St. Mihiel salient, a protrusion in the Allied line that had been held by German forces since 1914, and that complicated defensive arrangements in the region. And Pershing saw in this operation an opportunity to demonstrate that American troops could plan, coordinate, and execute a major offensive under their own command. The preparation involved meticulous coordination between infantry, artillery, tanks, and air support, because modern warfare demanded synchronization rather than isolated bravery, and Pershing understood that success would depend not on dramatic charges, but on disciplined movement and logistical reliability. And as American units advanced in September, they achieved their objectives more rapidly than many observers had predicted, capturing territory and prisoners while shortening the front line in a way that improved Allied positioning. The significance of St. Mihiel was not measured solely in geographic terms, but in psychological ones, because it confirmed that the American Expeditionary Forces could operate as a cohesive, effective army rather than a symbolic reinforcement, and it strengthened Pershing's argument that independence had been the correct strategic choice. Soon afterward came the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest operation in American military history up to that time, involving over 1 million American soldiers and forming part of a broader Allied push that would ultimately compel Germany to seek an armistice. And the scale of this campaign presented challenges that tested every aspect of Pershing's leadership, from supply chains to communication networks to the coordination of units inexperienced in sustained combat operations. The terrain was difficult, the objectives complex, and progress uneven at times. Yet Pershing adapted, reorganized commands when necessary, and emphasized persistence without recklessness, understanding that the cumulative effect of pressure across the front mattered more than any single dramatic advance. And although the offensive demanded endurance and discipline, it demonstrated the capacity of American forces to sustain large-scale operations alongside their allies during the war's final months. By November 1918, as armistice negotiations advanced and the guns fell silent, the American Expeditionary Forces had grown into a formidable presence in Europe, not merely as reinforcements, but as a national army whose identity and independence had been preserved, fulfilling Pershing's original vision despite skepticism and logistical obstacles that had once seemed overwhelming. The story of General John J. Pershing and the American Expeditionary Forces is not simply a narrative of troop movements or battlefield maps, but a story about how a nation defines its role when confronted with global responsibility. Because Pershing's insistence on independence shaped not only military outcomes, but the future perception of the United States as a power capable of organizing, deploying, and sustaining a large modern army across an ocean. It is also a reminder that leadership often requires balancing cooperation with conviction, that respecting allies does not require surrendering identity, and that preparation, patience, and strategic clarity can transform uncertainty into credibility over time. As we reflect on the journey from a modest peacetime army to a decisive force on the Western Front, perhaps the enduring question is this: when faced with pressure to conform or compromise in moments of crisis, how do leaders decide which principles must remain intact and which adjustments are necessary for success, knowing that their choices will shape not only immediate outcomes, but the legacy that follows?